The night the saloon doors swung wide and silence fell across the smoky room. Every set of eyes turned toward the figure who had just stepped inside. Her shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, her face pale but steady. And though the chatter of men and the clink of whiskey glasses had filled the place only seconds before, it was her words that broke the hush. With a trembling but resolute voice, she declared, "I need a husband tonight." Folks in that frontier town had seen plenty of things: gunfights in the dust of Main Street, poker games ending in broken bottles, cattle drives storming through at dawn, but never had anyone witnessed a widow, heavy with child, stand tall in the middle of a saloon full of rough-necked men and speak so plainly. Her words rattled through the air like the crack of a whip, and every man leaned back just a little, unsure whether to laugh, scoff, or take her seriously. The woman was known to most of them, at least by sight. She had come to town months earlier, trailing behind a wagon that carried all she owned. She hadn't spoken much since arriving, keeping to herself on the edge of the settlement. Living in a cabin that had once belonged to a trapper, folks whispered about her late husband, how he had died out on the trail, leaving her alone to face the world. Some said she had been a school teacher before marriage. Others swore she'd been raised on a farm back east. No one could quite pin down the truth, and that mystery made her even more fascinating now, under the glow of oil lamps. Her presence stirred the place like a storm rolling in across the plains. Behind her calm eyes burned something fierce, a mix of fear and determination. Her belly told the tale of months gone by, and no one in the room could deny it. She was a pregnant widow, and in a town where survival was a daily gamble, her situation was more perilous than most dared admit. The sheriff, sitting in the corner nursing his drink, shifted uneasily. He had seen trouble take root in small ways, arguments that grew into feuds, secrets that spread like wildfire, and he knew her words were bound to stir both curiosity and conflict. Still, he said nothing, watching to see who might rise to answer her call by the bar. The piano player froze mid-song, his hands hovering over the keys. A card dealer paused, his deck fanned out like the wings of a bird in flight. Ranch hands and drifters exchanged glances, each man silently weighing the cost of what she asked. A husband meant responsibility, and responsibility out here was heavier than iron. Yet her voice had not been desperate, not begging. It carried the weight of choice. She was not pleading for help. She was laying down a challenge, and that unsettled them most of all. Outside, the wind whistled through the street, lifting dust across the wooden boardwalks. The prairie stretched endless beyond town, golden fields fading into the shadow of distant mountains. Life out there was unforgiving, and everyone knew a woman in her state could not last the winter alone. The question hanging in the air was who among them would dare step forward, not just to claim her hand, but to face the storm her words had surely unleashed. Whispers rippled through the room. Some wondered if she spoke out of fear of being cast aside when her child came. Others thought she might have some hidden reason, a bargain or inheritance no one knew about. A few men's eyes lit with greed, others with suspicion. And among them all, there were those who simply stared in awe, unsure whether she was the bravest or the most reckless soul they had ever seen. The barkeep, polishing a glass with slow circles, muttered under his breath, "Lord help us." This town wasn't ready for tonight. The widow did not flinch at the stares. She met their eyes one by one, as if daring them to test her resolve. Her hands rested calmly over her rounded belly, and in that gesture lay the truth: her life was no longer her own, and she would do whatever it took to secure a future for the child yet to be born. A rancher leaned against the bar, his jaw tight. He had cattle to tend, land to fight for, and scars from battles already lost. He wasn't sure he could afford another burden. A drifter near the door smirked, adjusting the brim of his hat, as though he found the whole thing amusing. Yet even he didn't leave. The spell of her words held every soul captive. Time seemed to stretch, each heartbeat loud against the hush. Somewhere in the corner, a candle guttered low, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The widow's eyes lingered there, as if she knew the darkness that threatened to creep in if no one answered her plea at last. A chair scraped against the floor. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence. Every head turned, waiting to see who would rise, who would claim her words as their own. But before the man could take a step forward, the saloon doors creaked again. Another figure stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the fading twilight. Dust clung to his boots, and the set of his shoulders spoke of long miles ridden hard. His gaze swept the room before settling on her, and for the first time that night, her composure faltered just slightly. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loud. The widow's challenge still hung in the air, unanswered. And now the stranger's arrival only deepened the mystery. Would he be the one to step forward? Or would his presence stir the kind of trouble no one in town was ready for? The night was far from over, and though the lamps burned warm, a chill crept in that made the whole saloon feel like it stood on the edge of something no one could yet name. And in the silence that followed, her words lingered stronger than ever. "I need a husband tonight," echoing against the wooden beams and into the restless hearts of everyone who heard them. A promise that the town's fate was about to change forever. The room held its breath as the stranger stood in the doorway. Dust rising from his boots as though he had ridden straight through the desert without pause. His hat shaded most of his face, but the cut of his jaw and the weight in his eyes suggested he had seen more miles, no more sorrow than most men in the saloon combined. No one knew his name, and yet his presence was enough to make the widow falter for just an instant. It was not fear that crossed her face, but something closer to recognition, though faint and unspoken. The sheriff, still seated in the corner, shifted again in his chair. He was a man who trusted patterns and habits, the way men carried themselves, the words they chose when they thought no one was listening. And something about the stranger's silence set his instincts on edge. It was not the silence of a coward, nor the quiet of a man with nothing to say. It was the measured stillness of one who waited until the world came to him. The widow's words still hung heavy in the air. "I need a husband tonight." Every man in that room had turned them over in his mind. Some had considered the meaning plain and simpler woman in her state could not survive another season alone. Others sensed a deeper weight, a secret bound within her plea. To ask in a saloon, of all places, was no accident. She wanted her words carried, remembered, and judged by the roughest ears in town. The stranger stepped further inside, his boots knocking against the worn boards. The bartender straightened, but said nothing. The piano man set his hands in his lap, waiting. No one dared break the spell, for the night was becoming something larger than itself, the kind of story that would be told long after the dust settled as the man took a place by the wall. The widow's gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat too long before moving across the crowd once more. Her strength returned, her shoulders squared, and she spoke again, not loud, but steady enough for all to hear. "I have no time to waste. My child will be born before the snow falls, and I will not bring it into this world without a name to shield it." The words cut through the smoke like a blade. The rancher at the bar swallowed hard, though he kept his eyes fixed on his drink. The drifter by the door, who moments earlier had been smirking, now wore a different, look cautious, calculating. Behind her firm voice was a story not yet told. And though the men in the saloon had their guesses, none knew the full truth. Months earlier, when she had first appeared on the edge of town, her wagon worn and her dress torn at the hem, the townsfolk had wondered how she managed the journey at all. She had buried her husband along the trail, that much was certain. For the preacher himself had seen the small wooden cross she placed in the earth just outside town. But beyond that, she had spoken little. She built a life on the cabin grounds, mended her own fences, planted what she could in the hard soil, and worked as though she bore no weakness. It was only as her belly grew that whispers began to spread. Some claimed her late husband had been no ordinary man, that he had left debts behind or enemies still searching. Others suggested she had been promised to another before the marriage, and that the child in her womb carried a question mark that no vow could answer. Few dared ask her outright, for she carried herself with a quiet dignity that demanded respect. Still, the rumors wound their way through the town like wildfire in dry grass. Now those whispers hung over the saloon, each man wondering whether stepping forward would mean salvation or ruin. The stranger by the wall finally tipped his hat back, revealing eyes that were tired yet sharp. He did not speak, but he studied her as though piecing together a puzzle he had long carried. His silence was louder than any words, for it seemed to unnerve the room more than her own declaration. The sheriff knew trouble when he saw it, but he also knew this was not the kind he could stop with a badge or a bullet. It was a kind born of secrets, the sort that could pull an entire town into its grasp. He leaned back, his hand resting on his belt, waiting to see who would make the first move. The widow, unshaken, continued, "I do not ask for charity, nor pity. I ask for a man with enough courage to claim tomorrow with me. This land does not forgive the weak, and I will not let my child grow without a name that carries weight." Her words echoed against the rafters, and though her voice was calm, it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through hesitation. She was not offering comfort, nor was she promising love. She was offering a challenge, one that few could meet without questioning their own worth. The rancher thought of his cattle, his land, and the neighbors who circled like wolves at the edge of his property. To take her hand would mean binding himself to her burdens, and he was not sure his shoulders could bear more. The drifter near the door thought of the freedom he cherished, the road that called to him with every sunrise. A wife and child would chain him in place, yet the thought of her resolve tempted him in ways he had not expected, and the stranger, whose silence loomed over them all, seemed to carry his own war inside. His gaze never wavered, his jaw set, as though he weighed not just her words but the past that clung to her. Some in the room began to wonder if he had known her before, if their paths had crossed in some forgotten town or along some nameless trail. The bartender finally spoke. "Hey, you're asking for more than you know, miss. A husband ain't just a name. Out here, it's blood and bone. And every man that steps forward has to live with the choice." She turned her eyes to him, unflinching. "Then let the one with the right heart be bold enough to step forward. I will not beg. I will not wait." Her words settled once more into silence, and the saloon seemed to shrink under the weight of it. Men shifted in their chairs, some avoiding her gaze, others caught in it like deer before a flame. The stranger by the wall did not move, but his hand brushed the brim of his hat, a gesture so small it was nearly lost. Yet the widow saw it, and something in her eyes flickered a memory, a question, or perhaps a fear. The piano man, restless, pressed a single key, the note trembling into the room before dying away. It was enough to break the stillness, though not the tension. For every man present, the choice hung heavier now than when she had first spoken. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain on distant fields. The lamps flickered in the draught, and shadows stretched across the floor. The night was far from over. The story was only beginning to unfold. No one knew who would rise first, nor what price would be paid when the truth behind her plea came to light. The widow stood strong, her hand resting on the life within her, while the town waited for a decision that would change them all, and in the back of every mind lingered the same question: was her plea a call for salvation, or the opening to a storm that none of them were ready to weather? The answer had yet to come, and as the lamps burned low, the saloon seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next word, the next step, the next twist in a tale that had only just begun. The storm that began in the saloon that night did not fade with the clink of whiskey, glasses, or the shuffle of boots against wooden floors. It followed the townsfolk home, whispering in their ears as they lay restless in their beds, and it carried into the dawn like a stubborn wind that would not let the prairie rest. By morning, every corner of the settlement buzzed with the widow's words. Women at the well repeated her declaration with hushed voices, while ranch hands out on the range replayed the scene in their minds. "I need a husband tonight." It was a phrase that had lit a fire none could ignore. The widow herself returned to her cabin beyond the edge of town. She walked with her head high, though her heart pounded with the weight of what she had set in motion. She had not chosen the saloon by chance. If her words had been spoken in the quiet of the church or the safety of a neighbor's porch, they would have died in the dust before reaching the ears that mattered. But in the saloon, where stories grew like weeds and spread like smoke, her plea would not only be remembered, it would be tested. The The stranger who had entered that night had stayed only as long as the widow remained. When she stepped out into the darkness, he followed at a distance, though not close enough for her to notice. His horse, tied just beyond the hitching post, stamped its hooves restlessly. He mounted without a word and kept to the shadows, trailing her path until he saw the faint glow of a lantern in her cabin window. Only then did he turn his horse toward the hills, as though satisfied with simply knowing where she rested in town. The sheriff could not shake the unease that had settled in his gut. He was a man who had kept the peace through years of hard choices. But this matter was not one he could resolve with a badge or a cell. It was tangled in secrets, and secrets were dangerous currency. He took a slow ride along the main street, tipping his hat to the early risers, all the while turning over the widow's words in his mind. A woman asking for a husband was not unusual in itself, but the way she had done it, in the heart of the saloon, left him with a sense that there was more beneath the surface. By mid-morning, small groups gathered outside the general store, the blacksmiths, and even the churchyard. Some claimed she was desperate, others believed she was bold, but all agreed she was changing the rhythm of the town. The blacksmith, a man who had lived through loss himself, spoke quietly to those who would listen. "It ain't just about a name. That woman carries something none of us see yet. Mark my words. She wouldn't stand in front of a room full of men unless the need was greater than pride." The rancher who had sat stiff at the bar that night returned to his cattle with a troubled brow. He had seen the flicker of resolve in her eyes, and though he told himself her burden was too much to carry, the thought gnawed at him. A widow with child could not tend land alone. He thought of his own fields, the fences needing repair, the long winters when company could mean survival. Still, the risk was heavy. A man who tied himself to another's troubles could see his own dreams swallowed whole. The drifter, meanwhile, found himself drawn to the saloon again by afternoon. He had no land, no claim, nothing to lose but his freedom. Yet the words of the widow followed him like a shadow. He ordered a drink and leaned on the counter, half hoping someone would bring up her name so he could weigh the talk. Sure enough, voices around the poker table soon turned to her, each man tossing in his own speculation. Some swore she was hiding wealth, a hidden inheritance or land deed that made her offer worth more than it seemed. Others suggested enemies would follow her, and that marrying her was as good as painting a target on one's back. The piano player, who had seen her eyes more clearly than most from his place on the stage, said little, but his silence spoke volumes. He had recognized something that night, though he could not put it into words. It was the look of someone who had chosen their path before the rest of the world even realized there was a choice to make. The stranger rode the outskirts of town, watching from afar. He kept to himself, making no move to enter the saloon again, but the sight of him unsettled those who caught glimpses. Children spoke of a lone rider passing the ridge at dawn, his horse moving like it knew the land by memory. Some said he was a bounty hunter, others whispered he was tied to the widow's past. Whatever the truth, his silence and distance only added to the tension building across the settlement. The widow's cabin became a subject of gossip. Women passing along the trail carried word that she was seen working in her small garden, her movements slower now, but no less steady. A few suggested visiting her, but most hesitated, as though her choice to make such a bold statement set her apart from the rest. Even the preacher kept his distance, unsure how to approach a woman who had spoken her truth not in the church but in the saloon, where whiskey and sin often outweighed scripture. As the days stretched on, the widow's plea began to twist into different forms. To some men it became a temptation, the chance to claim not just a wife, but a story worth telling. To others, it was a warning, a burden best avoided. Yet none could deny the ripple it had caused. Conversations that once revolved around cattle, crops, or the price of supplies now bent inevitably back to her. The sheriff decided to pay her a visit, though he rode slow, as if giving himself time to reconsider. When he arrived, she was splitting wood, her shawl falling from her shoulders in the morning sun. He dismounted and greeted her with the kind of cautious respect that came natural to him. She did not invite him inside, nor did she seem surprised at his arrival. "You've stirred the whole town," he said plainly. Leaning on the fence, "I did what I had to," she answered, pausing only long enough to wipe her brow. "A woman alone has no place out here. A woman with a child even less." The sheriff nodded, though. He studied her closely. There was no fear in her eyes, only a stubborn resolve that reminded him of the land itself, hard, unyielding, and honest. He asked no more, for he knew pressing her would yield little. Still, as he rode back to town, he felt certain her story held more than she had shared. In the saloon that evening, the rancher found himself in quiet talk with the drifter. Both men circled the subject, neither willing to admit the thought of her weighed heavy on them. They spoke of cattle prices, of the coming winter, of the stranger who lingered in the hills, but beneath it all was the unspoken question. Which of them, if any, would take the step no one else dared? The stranger's shadow stretched longer each night, and the town began to feel as though it balanced on a knife's edge. The widow's cabin light flickered in the distance, her figure sometimes seen moving slowly past the window. Each man who thought of her weighed courage against fear, need against pride, and still her words lingered, echoing through every corner of their minds. She had asked not for charity, not for pity, but for a husband that very night. Though days had passed, the urgency of her voice had not faded. It clung to the air like smoke, pressing on every heart that heard it, daring them to answer before it was too late. The conflict had taken root, and no one yet knew which way it would grow. Some feared it would tear the town apart. Others whispered it might bind them together in ways they had never imagined. The truth remained hidden, waiting for the moment when choices would no longer be put off. When silence could no longer hold back the storm that was bound to break, the widow had thrown her stone into the still waters, and the ripples reached farther with each passing day. And though the lamps burned in the saloon, though the cattle grazed on the hills, though the church bell rang each Sunday morning, nothing in the town felt the same as it had before she spoke those words. The question of who would rise to meet her challenge remained unanswered, and until it was, every man, woman, and child in the settlement knew they were living on the edge of a story that was not yet finished. The days rolled into nights, and the whole town seemed to hang on a single thread. What had started as a bold plea in the saloon had turned into a storm no one could escape. The widow's words lingered in every corner, as if carved into the walls of the place itself. "I need a husband tonight." They had not been answered, but neither had they faded. They grew heavier with each sunrise, pressing on the townsfolk until even the simplest tasks felt shadowed by them. The stranger's presence on the ridge above the town was spoken of in low voices. Children pointed at him when they saw his silhouette against the sky, his horse moving slow and steady along the horizon. Women whispered to one another that he was waiting for something, perhaps waiting for her to call him by name. Men muttered suspicions, wondering if he carried a bounty on her, or if he was tied to debts left by her husband. His silence unsettled them all. For a man who watches without speaking holds more power than one who brags aloud. The sheriff grew more restless as the talk deepened. He had seen quarrels start over less one man's pride against another's hunger, and he knew the widow's challenge was no longer her burden alone. It was now the town's. The saloon filled each evening with men circling the subject like wolves around a campfire. The rancher who had thought of his cattle and fences found himself staring into his drink, wrestling with the memory of her eyes. The drifter, still clinging to his freedom, began to wonder if freedom meant much when her voice echoed in his head every time the night turned quiet. One evening, the widow walked into town again, her shawl pulled tight, her face pale but determined. She went not to the saloon this time, but to the general store. Even there, her presence stopped conversations. She gathered flour, salt, and kerosene, her movements careful but steady. The storekeeper watched her with a mix of pity and admiration, while two ranch hands outside murmured about the way she carried herself. No weakness showed in her, but they knew her time was drawing close. A woman heavy with child could not wait forever. That night, the storm broke in whispers before the rain ever came. A man arrived in town from the east, a trader with a wagon load of supplies. Over drinks in the saloon, he let slip that he had seen wanted posters not far back along the trail. He didn't remember the names, but he recalled a woman's description and a man's shadowy figure tied to debts and betrayal. The words struck like lightning. Though nothing was certain, the thought of the widow carrying a secret past lit suspicion like dry brush. Some men said she must be hiding from more than loneliness. Others argued it was just another story, no more than the kind travelers loved to spread. But the stranger on the ridge seemed to confirm the rumor in their minds. He was no ordinary wanderer. His horse was too well kept, his gear too steady for a man drifting aimlessly. The sheriff began to wonder if he had been sent to watch her, or worse, to claim her when the time was right. He could not shake the feeling that the widow's plea had been less about desperation and more about survival against a shadow that was now closing. The widow herself sat in her cabin by lamplight, staring at the wooden cross outside her window where her husband rested beneath the soil. She whispered prayers, though her voice was low and uncertain. She thought of the life inside her, restless and pressing against her ribs, reminding her that time was running short. Her boldness in the saloon had not been without fear. It had been born from it. She knew whispers would spread, but she also knew silence would kill her faster than gossip. The town began to split in quiet ways. Some men spoke of stepping forward, not out of love, but out of pride, or the hope of gaining something unseen. Others warned that taking her hand would bring ruin, that the stranger's watchful eyes meant more than any of them understood. The women, too, debated her choice, some admiring her courage, while others feared she had invited danger to all their doors. As the tension built, the stranger finally rode down from the ridge one late afternoon. His horse's hooves struck the dry earth with measured weight as he passed through the main street. Men stepped aside, women pulled their children close. He did not speak a word, but his presence sent a shiver through every soul. He tied his horse at the trough and walked into the saloon. The room froze. He stood tall, scanning the faces, as if taking account of every man who had heard her words that night. The sheriff's hand hovered near his belt, but he waited. The stranger ordered a drink, his voice low, his words few. He drank slow, then set the glass down with finality before leaving as quietly as he had entered. No threats, no claims, just silence heavy enough to choke the air. That silence spread deeper than any rumor. By nightfall, the talk in the saloon had shifted. Some men swore the stranger had come for her. Others believed he was guarding her. A few muttered that he was the one she had truly been waiting for. None of them knew, but the not knowing was worse than any truth. The sheriff decided he could wait no longer. The next morning he rode out to her cabin once more. She was at her table, mending clothes with careful stitches, her hands trembling only when she thought no one could see. He asked her directly about the stranger, about the rumors, about what danger might be at her heels. She met his eyes but gave no answers, only repeating what she had said before. "My child will be born soon. I will not face it alone." The sheriff left more troubled than before. He knew a storm was coming, one that would not end with the birth of her child but with blood. Secrets and choices too heavy for any one person to carry. By evening, the rancher had returned to the saloon, his face lined with decision yet clouded with doubt. He was joined by the drifter, who spoke less boldly than he once had. Both men seemed caught in the same net, unwilling to admit that her challenge had tied their fates tighter than they wished. The stranger appeared again that night, not in the saloon, but outside the widow's cabin. He stood in the shadows near her fence, watching as her lantern burned late. When the sheriff rode past, patrolling the quiet edges of town, he saw the figure there, silent as stone. He did not call out, nor did the stranger move. Their eyes met only briefly, but in that look the sheriff read more than words could tell. The stranger was not simply a wanderer. He was part of her story, perhaps the part she could not speak aloud. The town felt the air tighten with each passing hour. Every conversation turned to her. Every glance at the horizon looked for the stranger's silhouette. The preacher spoke of storms and trials on Sunday, though he never named her. The blacksmith worked his forge with restless strikes, as if beating back the weight of silence. The piano man played tunes in the saloon that fell flat, no song able to chase the shadow away, and the widow, sitting in her cabin with her shawl wrapped close, felt the walls pressing tighter. She had spoken once with boldness, but now her voice was quiet, her strength drawn inward as she prepared for what was coming. She knew the moment was near, that the storm she had called upon herself would not pass without tearing through the lives of everyone around. The town waited. The men wrestled with choices, and the stranger drew closer each night. Tension filled the air so thick it felt like the prairie itself held its breath. Something was about to break, something none of them could stop. And the only question left was who would rise when the final moment came. The climax was near, and every soul in town knew it. The night the storm finally broke. The saloon was crowded tighter than it had been in years. Men filled every chair, women lingered at the windows, and the sheriff kept his eyes sharp from the corner. The widow had come again, walking with slow steps, but holding her head high. Her shawl hung loose about her shoulders, her belly full with the weight of new life. No one dared look away from her as she crossed the floor. Her boots tapping steady against the wood, she stopped in the center of the room, just as she had the night she first spoke, and the silence that fell was deeper than before. For days, rumors had twisted through the town like thorn vines. The stranger's presence, the whispers of wanted posters, the restless shifting of men who could not shake her words, all of it had built to this moment. Every soul present knew something would be decided before the night was at. The stranger stepped through the doors not long after. His boots were caked with trail dust, his eyes dark but clear. He carried no weapon in hand, yet his presence was heavy enough to make even the boldest gambler pause. He walked slow, each step measured, until he stood near her, though not close enough to touch. His gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every man who had thought to claim her. None held it for long. The sheriff rose from his chair, hand resting near his belt. "If this is the night," he said, his voice carrying steady, "then let the truth be told plain. This town won't carry half-truths any longer." The widow turned, her eyes fierce yet weary. She looked first at the sheriff, then at the stranger, and finally at the room full of faces waiting for her to speak. Her voice came steady, though the weight of it pressed against her chest. "I asked for a husband because I could not stand alone any longer. But I will not lie. The man who follows me is tied to my past. He is not enemy, nor savior. He is the reminder of what I've lost, and of what I must protect." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she raised her hand to still them. "My husband is buried out there in the soil. He was a good man, but the trail we traveled was long, and not all debts were paid along the way. This man," she gestured toward the stranger, "rode with him once before I came into the picture. They shared battles, promises, and mistakes. When my husband fell, this man carried word back to me. And when I left that place behind, I knew he would follow sooner or later." The stranger nodded slightly, as if her words were a truth he could not deny. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but sure. "I came not to claim her, nor to threaten. I came because a promise was left unfinished. I swore to her husband that his child would not be left without a shield. I meant to keep it, whether or not she wanted me near." The saloon held its breath. The widow's eyes softened, though her body trembled with the strain of standing so firm. "I don't need a shadow from the past," she said. "I need someone who will stand beside me, not behind me. That is why I spoke those words that night. I need a husband tonight. Not because I am weak, but because the world will not allow me to walk this road alone." The rancher shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He had fought with himself for days, torn between caution and the pull of her courage. He rose slowly, the room watching every movement. His voice cracked at first, but he steadied it. "I got land. I got cattle. I got burdens of my own. But I'll tell you this plain. A woman who can stand in this saloon, facing a room full of men without fear, is stronger than half of us. If you'll have me, I'll put my name beside yours. Not for pity, not for pride. For the sake of the child, and for the sake of building something worth keeping." The words struck deep. The drifter, who had toyed with the idea, but loved his freedom too much, leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He knew in that moment he would not step forward. The piano man's hands hovered near the keys, as if ready to score the moment, but he stayed still. All eyes returned to the widow. She studied the rancher, her gaze weighing him carefully. He did not look away. Finally, she nodded, though her face showed both relief and sorrow. "Then stand with me. But know this, it will not be an easy road. I carry not only a child, but the past. And the past does not let go easily." The stranger stepped closer now, his voice carrying enough for all to hear. "If you choose him, I will not stand in the way. My promise will be kept either way. I'll see to it that no harm comes near while breath is in me. When the child comes, it will not know the hunger of an unguarded life." The sheriff, satisfied at last, lowered his hand from his belt. Then it settled. This town's had enough of whispers. Tonight, the widow's words are answered, and the rest is between her and the man she chooses. The saloon let out a breath it had been holding for weeks. Some men shook their heads, some nodded in respect, and others muttered about the strange ways fate bound lives together. The widow, weary but steady, reached for the rancher's hand. He took it, rough palm against rough palm, sealing not just a choice, but a future that would test them both. The stranger tipped his hat, his shadow stretching across the floor. He turned toward the doors, his boots striking steady against the boards. Outside, the night air was cool, the prairie wide and waiting. He mounted his horse and rode toward the horizon, not vanishing, but not staying either. His role was not to claim, only to protect from the edges. It's like a guardian who asked nothing in return. Weeks later, the snow began to dust the hills. The widow gave birth to a son. The cabin glowed with the warmth of fire, and the cries of new life filled the air. The rancher sat beside her, weary but proud, his hand resting on her shoulder. In the distance, a lone rider's silhouette lingered against the ridge, watching only long enough to be sure the promise was kept before disappearing once more into the open land. The town settled slowly back into its rhythm, though it was never quite the same. The widow's bold words had changed it, reminding every soul that courage was not found only in guns or land, but in the will to face a room full of doubters and speak the truth aloud. Men who once scoffed now spoke of her with respect. Women drew strength from her story, teaching their children that the future belonged to those who dared to claim it. The saloon still buzzed each evening, but whenever the story was told, it carried weight. Folks remembered the night a pregnant widow stunned the saloon with words no one expected. They remembered how she stood tall, how men weighed their choices, and how the town itself had been pulled into her storm. And they remembered that when the dust finally settled, she had not begged, but chosen. Shaping her own fate with the strength that had carried her all along, her words lived on. Not as a desperate cry, but as a lesson carved into the heart of the frontier. Strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it is the steel of a gun or the sweat of the fields. But sometimes it is the courage of a woman who refuses to bow, who demands a future not just for herself, but for the life she carries. And so, the story closed. Not with silence, but with a reminder. The night she declared her need changed them all, and the echo of her voice lingered long after. On the edge of the wild land in a small town that once lived only by the rhythm of cattle and cards, the widow gave them something more enduring than gossip. She gave them a tale of survival, of resolve, and of the kind of courage that turns whispers into legend. The town would never forget. And neither would the child who grew beneath her heart that night. The saloon, the sheriff, the stranger, the rancher all became part of the story of the pregnant widow who stunned the saloon with her words. A story that would be told as long as the prairie winds carried voices, reminding all who listened that sometimes the boldest stand comes not from the strongest arm, but from the truest heart, top of form, bottom of form.